welcome to Behind the Shadows. My name is Susan Finelli, and I am the host and author of Behind the Shadows, a program where we go behind the shadows of what meets the eye. Tonight, I am thrilled to tell you that we are going to be talking about Louis Satchmo Armstrong, who's quoted as no sour notes, and our guest is going to explain that to us this evening. And we're going to look at the legend of Louis Armstrong through the eyes and life of Ms. Phoebe Jacobs. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Talking about my favorite person in the whole world.
I know, and I'm so thrilled that my friend John introduced me to you.
Okay.
And you have such a rich story to tell, so please tell it.
Well, okay. Well, thank you for just giving me freedom to express what I really feel so deeply and how consumed I am. I attribute a great deal of the woman I am today, to what I learned from people like Louis Armstrong, that I was fortunate enough and blessed enough to be exposed to them. And it all came about, although my family has never been a real musical family, my mother's nephew, Ralph Watkins, opened nightclubs and exposed me to jazz and introduced me to Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington via recordings when I was in my teens. Mm-hmm. And I suddenly became a ardent fan, mm-hmm. because in those days, I guess, Duke Ellington was the rage. People were dancing. There was the, Savoy Ballroom. There was 52nd Street, mm-hmm. with all these wonderful jazz clubs. You're too young to remember any of that.
But as I understand, that's like Basin Street down in New Orleans.
That's exactly,
correct?
Well, yeah. That's what Louis brought New Orleans to New York, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. And the exciting thing about this was that I had the good fortune not only to work around these people through Ralph Watkins and the clubs he owned, and I worked for him, but to also become more than just someone that would help them.
Yes.
For example, when I worked in the nightclub, Basin Street, I was a telephone answerer. Mm-hmm. And when I knew Ella Fitzgerald or Duke Ellington or Louis Armstrong, it was good evening or good afternoon or good night. I mean, they weren't my friends. Mm-hmm. I was working in a club, mm-hmm. and they were the stars.
Well, I understand Ella Fitzgerald was a very private person.
Oh my God, it took 10 years before she invited me to have a cup of coffee with her.
What broke the ice?
oh, I know. It was a bad night, and we woke up 2 o'clock in the morning. I was getting ready to go home, and she's her last show. And I said to her, Miss Fitzgerald, Lucky said he'll drive us to your hotel, and he's going to take me home. So we got into the car, and she said to me, you can wish me a happy birthday. So I said, oh, how exciting is your birthday? In fact, her birthday was yesterday.
Oh, yesterday. Oh.
And I said to her, tell me the most exciting birthday party you ever had. She looked at me like I was some kind of a nut, and she said, whoever had a birthday party? She says, we are not in a place where we know enough people to invite to a party.
To sing happy birthday.
Right. So I thought to myself when I got home, oh, I got to make Ella a birthday party, surprise.
Yeah.
So I planned that, and I did make it, and I think she was so touched by it. In fact, you were in my house, and you saw a picture of me and Duke Ellington and Ella. Oh. That was the birthday party.
Well, I have to tell our audience that Phoebe's home is a tribute to jazz. I mean, I just was, in awe of everything I saw in her apartment.
Well, when you live as long as I do, Susan, you collect enough pictures. And my Susie said to me, my daughter said, Mom, we got to get those pictures on the wall. You can't leave them in the... So that's what I have, a wall of all the pictures of people that I was fortunate enough to be part of. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing was I learned from all of them. They were like teachers to me because they were a shining example of what good living was about. Mm-hmm. You see, now you take some of these groups, the Elephants, the Earlobes, or whatever the groups are called, and they get exorbitant amounts of money, and they come out in sweatshirts and jeans.
Ripped jeans.
Sneakers, yeah. Ill-kempt. Everyone that I ever worked with came out with a tuxedo. Mm-hmm. They were shiny, spanky, clean, and whatever they had to do for their audience was extraordinary.
Yeah, yeah.
And they didn't get the hundreds of thousands of dollars that the contemporary groups get.
Today.
But I learned from them that they were very proud of their profession, and they were proud of what they had to do, and all they wanted to do was live for their audience. And that was Louis.
That was Louis.
It's no magic that Louis is still loved by so many people and still lives in every corner of the world, because there isn't a day that goes by that we aren't, when I say we, I'm part of the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation, and we're not approached for something involving Louis for a school.
Well, I know he loved children.
That he did. He did.
And I read a quote somewhere that he said that, you know, there's no kid that don't like me. You know? I heard that somewhere.
Well, that's very true. I guess children feel that you care about them. And then Mrs. Armstrong used to tell a story that when they went to visit the Pope, and he had a special audience with the Pope. Oh my God. And the Pope asked him if he has any children. So he said, no, Your Eminence, or whatever, however you address the Pope, but we're still working on it. And Lucille said she wanted to hit him. She was so embarrassed. But again, the relationship all grew out of the things we shared. So consequently, he trusted me.
Yes.
You know, because remember, we're living in a racist society.
Well, yeah, that was something I want to talk about, because really he was born only 40-odd years after the end of slavery. So, I mean, and you know, I find it interesting, one of his signature songs, which is one of my favorites, it's A Wonderful Life. But I'm sure it wasn't a wonderful life for him all the time.
Well, you got to understand one thing about Louis. He felt, you said no sour notes.
No sour notes.
Louis' philosophy was that each one of us our own choreographer. We could take a situation and we could see the shiny side of it, the glass is half full or half empty.
Right.
And he chose to look at the bright side of life. And the song you're referring to is What a Wonderful World.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke.
And
Wonderful World.
And that's what he felt about living. He felt that living was good, and he was so grateful that when he started his own Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation in 1969, and I said to him, Pops, what do you want a foundation for? Sammy Davis doesn't have it. Harry Belafonte doesn't have it. What do you need one? He said, well, I want to give back to the world some of the goodness I got.
So through all his hardships, he only embraced the good.
Yes,
he only embraced
and
the good.
He never chose to. But he was. He was exposed to racism.
Oh, he was discriminated against, and also I understand that he had a little beef with President Eisenhower on the school situation.
Right, right. Oh, he was very touched, as I understand. Again, Mrs. Armstrong related this story to me, although I read it in the newspapers. That he was in Arkansas and watching television, seeing these little black kids that couldn't get into school, and she said he cried like a baby to think that these kids couldn't get to a school. So he sent a telegram to the president saying, you better get the state militia or something and get these kids into school.
Of course.
He was a wreck.
Yeah, it's absolutely
Is there anything that you feel that you want to ask me?
Oh, I have tons of things I want to ask you.
Oh, we haven't got all night.
Well, I know that he was revered by others in the music industry.
That's for sure.
That's for sure. And I know he had a relationship with Duke Ellington and Dizzy Gillespie. Right? And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the relationships he had with them. Now, I have some quotes that I'd like to read, and then perhaps then you can react to them.
Okay, good. Good, very good idea.
Duke Ellington says of Louis Armstrong, if anybody was Mr. Jazz, it was Louis Armstrong. He was the epitome of jazz and always will be. He is what I call an American standard, an American original. Well,
of course, Duke and Louis had a great rapport. In fact, I'm sure that you've had an opportunity to see Paris Blues when they were together. Because you see, most of the time, stars don't get a chance to work together because they're not in the same city at the same time.
Right.
So when these guys got a chance to work together, they enjoyed each other enormously.
Yes.
Of course, Duke was very proper. Duke was always interested in increasing his vocabulary and really being very articulate, where Louis was a natural. He used four-letter words before it was stylish to use four-letter words, but he just was real. And the two of them together were wonderful, and one of the things is that Duke had an appreciation for him. And he wanted every member of his band, when he hired a musician, I want him to be a Louis Armstrong. That meant he wanted them to be as passionately involved in their music as Louis was.
Well, to this day, I believe he's referred to as the ambassador of jazz.
Yes. That was Dave Brubeck who also gave him that title.
Yes. Before I continue with the quotes, how did he get the nickname Satchmo?
Well, the way I heard so many versions of it, but his version was that when he arrived in London, and you know, Louis had a large mouth and a lot of teeth, and he was always grinning, the British called him Satchel Mouth.
Oh, because it was big like a satchel.
And he just felt that, I guess maybe he just wanted to shorten it. So he just decided to call himself Satch.
And how did he get the nickname Pops?
Well, that was he did that.
Oh, he did that himself.
What happened is, for example, when I met him, he never remembered my name. I was the little girl that lost his music. he didn't remember my name, but he called me Pops. And he called anybody in the band Pops. Everybody was a Pops.
Everybody was a Pops.
Because that was easy. He didn't have to worry about not remembering a name. Just like Lionel Hampton used to call everybody Gates.
Gates.
You know, jazz musicians have a crazy style of forming their own language.
Yes.
You know, you've heard expressions.
I've heard it, their own language and beautiful music.
Yes.
And beautiful music. So Tony Bennett once said about Louis Armstrong, the bottom line in any country in the world is, what did we contribute to the world? We contributed Louis Armstrong.
Well, Tony, I guess, had a great, as Louis had for Tony, because Tony painted a portrait of Louis, and it hung in Louis' den. He was very proud of that portrait, and he said, you know, that boy lived in Astoria. He used to work in sing in a pizza parlor.
Right.
He never remembered his name.
He never remembered his name.
But he knew him. He knew him. In fact, he sat with Tony Bennett when he had a command performance before the King and Queen in London.
Oh.
Yes. He asked for Tony Bennett to be with. He just thought he really swung. He just loved Tony.
And Tony Bennett's still swinging.
Yes.
He's still swinging today. I'm going to switch now to one of Louis Armstrong's quotes. And he's talking about in the era of when racism surrounded his life. And I understand that he was revered around the world, treated like a king, but when he went back to New Orleans, he faced racist attitudes. So I found a quote I dug up in the archives, and he said, "I don't care if I ever see that city again," referring to New Orleans. "They treat me better all over the world than they do in my hometown. Ain't that stupid? Jazz was born there, and I remember when it wasn't no crime for cats of any color to get together and blow."
Well, you know, I think it's still true of New Orleans. I still think they suffer from a terrible inability for people to work together. I experienced something that was earth-shaking to me. Mrs. Armstrong was invited to be Queen of the Zulus. Do I have time to tell you this story?
Yes, you do.
And they have the Zulu parade for Mardi Gras. And she was invited to this, and she had a throne and a big float, and it was gorgeous, and it was all, you know, Afro-Americans. And at the end of the Zulu parade, that evening they had a gala, and she was the guest of honor. Well, she got all gussied up. She was an elegant lady, and beautifully dressed, and we go to this gala in this stunning hotel, the Roosevelt Hotel, I think. We go to the ballroom, and I'm with her friends, and I tell the lady I'm here with Mrs. Louis Armstrong, and they put a table, they give us a table near the toilet, like a terrible place. Terrible. So I walked back to the girl, and I said, you know, that's Mrs. Louis Armstrong. Did you make a mistake? She's the guest of honor. So she says, well, no, that's where she's sitting. So I came back to the table, and I said to Lucille, Lucille, I'm not staying here, and I don't want you to stay.
Let's leave.
It's an insult. Now, I'm from the North, and Lucille was from the North. Right. She never lived in the South. We didn't know that among the Afro-Americans, if you're dark, if you're an octoroon, you sit one place. If you're a cafe au lait, another place.
That's
in
incredible.
Other words, within their own race.
There's discrimination.
Yes.
There's discrimination.
Would you believe that? It was so heartbreaking to me. I just couldn't get over it.
And how long ago was this?
1972. one.
It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Now, before we went to air, you started to tell me a story about the statue of Louis Armstrong.
Oh,
what happened there?
Well,
what the heck happened?
Well, when Louis died, Representative John Conyers of Congress read into the minutes of a congressional meeting that we lost an American treasure.
Right.
That was Louis Armstrong. And he proposed that the board vote for $1 million to be given to the city of New Orleans for them to match it to do a park in honor of Louis Armstrong with a statue of his likeness. So that was started in 1971. Right. That's right after Louis died. New Orleans raised their $1 million. And the park was to be owned by the Parks Department of the United States government and the city of New Orleans, and we were helping them raise money for the statue. We got all this together, and maybe in '74 they unveiled the statue, stunning, 12 feet high, solid bronze statue of Louis Armstrong. Right. And right there in the park, and they have a big light, and they have gates with Armstrong Park, and it's like, it's a highlight of visiting the city. When I get a call 2 days ago, they asked me what happened to the statues. My friend says, I'm in New Orleans and there's no Louis Armstrong.
This was just 2 days ago.
2 days ago. I said, you got to be crazy. Yeah. So I started to call to find out what happened to that statue. Right. The Mayor Nagin, decided to take it up and put it in storage because he's going to do some things in the park.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
So I don't know when this statue is coming back. When it isn't coming back, write New Orleans and get them to get that statue in the park.
Get that statue back, audience.
Louis is New Orleans.
That's right. He's Mr. New Orleans, Mr. New Orleans. Now, Dizzy Gillespie, he had a quote, and he said, Louis Armstrong's station in the history of jazz is unimpeachable. If it weren't for him, there wouldn't be any of us.
Well, Dizzy lived near Louis in Corona.
In Corona.
And when he used to hear Louis warmed up on Cavaliere Rusticana or some kind of Italian opera. He loved Italian operas. And he used to, use all his notes and I don't know, the technical stuff for it. And when Dizzy would hear him play, he'd come ring the doorbell and see if he could sit in with, hey man, could I sit in? And they'd get together. And the last time he was with Dizzy was on television, was the Jackie Gleason show. Isn't that gorgeous? Where they sing, Louis said, I'm going to sing a song I hate, Toodle the Umbrella Song.
The Umbrella Song. I used to watch Jackie Gleason religiously with my grandmother. Jackie Gleason, the Ed Sullivan Show. So I was introduced to,
Well, they were pretty wonderful.
They were wonderful. And I used to see, Satchmo and Ella Fitzgerald. I used to walk around with the handkerchief.
One thing I'll tell you, that Dizzy adored Louis, and Louis adored him. You usually feel a rapport with people. It just doesn't
happen overnight.
No, and Louis was always very full of humility and very humble and very warm and loving.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Now, I have another quote from Wynton Marsalis, the
Wynton Marsalis, the musical director of Jazz Lincoln Center.
Exactly. And before I got to the quote, I was reading the history and his relationship and how he really didn't know too much about Louis Armstrong, and he started researching it. And he says, the more I know about music, the greater Louis Armstrong becomes.
Well, I must tell you that Wynton Marsalis, to me, is, well, first of all, Jazz at Lincoln Center is the house that Wynton built. And we take Wynton, an Afro-American gentleman from New Orleans, came up to this city in his 20s and became the darling of Lincoln Center, which is really the seat of all our culture right now. We have opera and ballet there and theater.
Right.
And when he got together to do Jazz at Lincoln Center, and he has things for children, he's got schoolrooms there and his after-school programs, and when he goes around the world, he invites school children into his rehearsals, or he'll visit schools. And Wynton is a classical musician. He could play with the symphony orchestra as well. And he's keeping our jazz alive, and he's also giving our jazz, Wynton Marsalis is giving jazz a wonderful image. Because he'll come out in one of his suits and really look handsome. And when he puts a program together, it is out of sight.
Well, speaking of giving jazz, I really want to let our audience know that you toot the horn for jazz. And you have been generous enough to share your library of records with colleges, and you speak, you know, all over. And I mean, you really keep Louis Armstrong's legend. He's a living legend today.
That's not hard.
He's a living legend. And your generosity, I mean, I've watched tapes of you, and I've done research, and your generosity comes from your heart.
Well, look, this is something you either feel or you don't, Susan.
Right,
you know?
Yeah.
And I can't help, but I must say, when I started to work with Ken Burns, the man that did the story of jazz, and when he called me and I said, what made you call me? He says, well, one of the musicians told me, if you want to know anything about jazz, you got to work with Phoebe Jacobs. And when I met with Ken Burns, he didn't, Louis Armstrong was something he knew about. But when I got through with him, and he being exposed, well, you know what he did in The King of Jazz. I mean, the story of jazz, Louis is laced all through it. This is justified because everybody has got a touch of Louis in their improvisation.
It's like a patchwork, a weave.
Right. And I must tell you, I am actively involved in the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation, which supports programs in schools, which is what Louis wanted.
Yes.
And we do hospital music therapy in the Beth Israel Hospital. In fact, the head of our music therapy program just came back from China, where she gave a lecture on treating the trauma victims of the earthquake. They invited her to go there. And it's all our music therapy program because Louis believed that music was something that made you feel better.
But I understand that the program in the hospital is amazingly successful with the children.
Oh, definitely.
I understand that it's really
but it's
making
also
a difference.
The adults now.
The adults also.
Of course, because we learned that from 9/11.
That's right.
When 9/11 occurred and we got a call from the hospital that we have firemen and policemen here that are in shock, watching people fall out of buildings and whatnot.
Oh, my goodness.
So we said, well, we would gladly help because we were only doing it for children, but we'd like a report on what music does for these people. We found out after 6 months of they gave us all the reports. It affects your appetite, your insomnia, heartbeat, pulse, mental attitude, depression, all these things are helped by music.
By music.
Yes, definitely. And it all emanated from Louis because Louis wanted his money as we got money because he only started his foundation himself. You know, there are a lot of people that have foundations, but he started it with his own $40,000. And $40,000 in '69.
It's a lot of money.
A newspaper was 2 cents, a Subway was 5 cents, so you know 40,000 was a lot of money. And he wanted us to be dedicated to using it for children and education. So we have a man by the name of Oscar Cohn, who's his representative, who negotiates for monies if you're going to use Louis' face or whatever. And if you see the poster behind me, it's called Jazzmen, Jazzmen. That poster is advertising the Jazzmen, Jasmine Rice. Now, there were 3 Oriental gentlemen after New Orleans Katrina that met with the Department of Agriculture in the city of New Orleans and told them that they would like to invest $1 million in teaching the farmers of New Orleans how to plant and grow rice. And they will name it after a jazz artist. And Louis loved red beans and rice.
That was his favorite. But there's one thing I do want to ask you, because unfortunately I wish we had like 3 hours to talk with you, but I don't. But when Louis Armstrong unfortunately came to the end of his life, I mean, it created waves of mourning around the world. And I remember reading an article in the Wall Street Journal where you were quoted, and you said, Louis Armstrong is not dead. What did you mean by that?
Well, again, in my capacity as the Executive Vice President of the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation, and I'm involved in his legacy and his heritage, on the website, the Louis Armstrong Archives is the place that everybody goes to get information on Louis. Now, In the course of a week, we have gotten requests from South Africa, from Romania, from Japan, from the Caribbean. People are constantly involved in wanting to learn or share in something about Louis.
To this day.
So as far as I'm concerned, the spirit of Louis Armstrong still lives.
Continues. Exactly, and as I said earlier, I've been to your home, and you get interrupted every 15 minutes with a phone call. Someone calling either about the jazz camp or about the hospital or the museum in Corona.
Right. Constantly, things are going on constantly.
Constantly,
yes.
And although he became a famous man, he was a humble man.
Oh, definitely.
He was a humble man.
Oh, definitely. He never believed. I used to say something very often to him. You're an international icon. So I said, and you're just so special. And Louis, come on.
Yeah, he was a humble. I mean, he lived out his days with his wife Lucille in Corona.
Yes, that's where she got to get an apartment for him. Well, please write in to Susan and tell her what you want to know about our foundation or Louis Armstrong.
That's right, and Phoebe was generous enough to tell me she'd come back and she'd share some films with us. So, unfortunately we've run out of time, but I want to thank you for coming and tooting the horn of
No,
jazz.
I should bring you Michael Cogswell, the guy that does the house things.
The house
things.
Yes, exactly.
Definitely.
Exactly. And if you want another episode of Jazz and Louis Armstrong, please contact me at susan@behindtheshadows.com. If there are other topics you would like to talk about, you can contact me. Also, if you've missed some of our episodes or if you'd like to see them again, you can go to my website at www.behindtheshadows.com. And remember, until next time, the brightest light shines behind the shadows.
Thank you for having me, Susan.
Oh, thank
you so much.
Thank you.